Hey friends, how's everybody doing? Good, good, good. Dry, dry, dry. Good, good, good. Out of the rain. I woke up in the middle of the night, per usual. Nothing new there. Little baby in our lives. But I was like, oh, look at the rain. It's raining? Tomorrow's Sunday. Oh my gosh. That was my 5 a.m. conversation to myself. Super thankful to be here. How are you? Michael, good to see you. Always good to see you, Michael. Today we're continuing on in our book of Esther. Last week, I don't know if you realized it or you felt it, but it was such a different rhythm of sermon last week as we kind of got into the book of Esther. Lots of story time, like mega storytelling, and then squeezed out like 3 applications at the very end. It was good for me, I guess, in the sense that, it gave me some time just to like absorb and digest this really fantastic book that's oftentimes overlooked in Scripture. And this week we're going to chew, instead of going through like 7 chapters, which is what we did all in one shot last week, no big deal, we're going to go through just one this week. And it's all around this conversation and really this question that we're asking by way of the series. Are you there? God is the question. And the question is, it's not a shallow question, and it's not an irrelevant question for our generation, nor was it an irrelevant or shallow question when Esther and Mordecai's people would have been asking the same thing. And if you weren't with us last week, I'm going to give you a micro overview of where we were in the book of Esther. It's the story of God's people displaced and dispersed in the Persian Empire. They're not in their own hometown. Their own hometown had been reduced to really nothing, rubble, as they were invaded by several other nations. And this small group of Jews were displaced in the Persian Empire, living under the ruthless rule of King Xerxes. King Xerxes was a bad king because he was a bad dude. He was not a great person, very much in love with himself, in love with his own power, the display of his power. He withheld himself from no pleasure, and it was very much on display through the book of Esther. And as we make our way into this week, we left last week really observing these what I'm going to call divine reversals. They were these massive reversals in the book of Esther where you had Esther was a Jewish young female. She was in the Persian Empire. They weren't loved by the Persian people. They were at best tolerated. Xerxes has this huge party, 180-something days, and at the end of it, in kind of this drunken stupor with all of his best mates, he calls on his queen, Vashti, to come and put her beauty on display, and she's like, not today, I'm not having that. And she actually gets banished for standing strong. She gets stripped of her queen title. She gets thrown out of the kingdom. And so Xerxes, by really what I would say is like a poor act of judgment, says, hey, you know what we should do? Let's go look for the next best, most beautiful woman in the kingdom. And I'm going to run a 1-year tournament of beauty, which will eventually crown the next queen. And Esther, in her kind of humble life, living without parents, she's an orphan. She's being raised by her relative Mordecai as like a father figure, gets swept into this competition, and eventually she is crowned queen of Persia. You'd think that it was status and fame and all of these luxuries, but it's actually like this dreaded position. She's at the beck and call of a king who is full of himself. So you can imagine the abuse that would have taken place as she would have been the sole queen of Persia. And the king is so full of himself, he doesn't just have a queen, he also has a harem, which isn't a single side chick. He's got like a whole house and side kingdom full of other interests of women, and they number in the hundreds, if not probably thousands over time. And Esther's job is to be at the beck and call of this king, but she's also heavily under this persecution of the number 2 person under Xerxes is this guy named Haman, do you remember this from the story last week? So Haman is like this full of himself, kind of junior carbon copy of Xerxes, and Haman being so full of himself, but also not necessarily a part of the kingdom yet, has the freedom to come and go in and outside of the palace. And every time he has the ability to come and go out of the palace, he requires everybody to bow at his kind of entry and exit of the king's palace. And there's one person, Esther's relative, Mordecai, who refuses to bow. So while everybody is on bended knee, boys to men status, Mordecai is not. Mordecai will not bend his knee. He's like, I will not give you what you want, because we find out that Mordecai and Haman are for 1,000 years. Their people group have been at odds with one another in vicious like war. And so Mordecai is like, not today. You ain't having none of this. None of my knees are touching that ground in your presence. So Haman, in the bitterness and the fullness of his own pride, goes and basically manipulates. He chirps into the ear of King Xerxes, and he says, you know what? There are some people who aren't respecting you as king. They have their own gods, and I know that you see yourself as a god, and they probably should have, they should be reprimanded for their defiance. And so Haman convinces King Xerxes in a real shady, very manipulative way to actually wipe out all of Mordecai's people, just the people group of the Jews scattered all throughout Persia. And there's like 120-something provinces where Jews would be living, and nobody knows that Esther is a Jew, because Mordecai, on her way to the kingdom, says, hide your nationality. Don't tell anybody what your family origins are. And so the king has a Jewish queen, but is unaware of it. Haman makes this rule that all the Jews will be wiped out in 11 months. And it is obviously devastating to the people who are living in Persia. We asked that question last week. Imagine the depth and the depression and the trauma that would be kind of at your doorstep if you as a family would be living in a community where they were plotting your demise in 11 months. Like, come Black Friday, that was going to be like the end of your family. It was like on the calendar, and everybody was waiting for the day when the kingdom would give permission to find their way onto your property and to take everything that you had. They could kill you. They could kill your children. They could take anything that they wanted. And I know inside of your mind, like my mind, as I was like placing myself in the story, I would have been like, yeah, I would have defended myself. I would have like taken up arms, and I would have gotten together with the other people who were like me. But the way that the law was written, there was no way that you could defend yourself. It was just your day of demise was on the calendar. And God starts to stir, even though in the book of Esther it's so unique. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. The book of Esther is written by a person, we don't know the author of it. I want to believe that it's Mordecai giving like cues to it, but you don't hear it really until the end of the book. But Esther makes a plan with Mordecai to have this big multi-day banquet with King Xerxes. And if you remember from last week, Esther, in her wisdom, is about to kind of unpack all the reality. She's going to like blow the top off of what's been happening. And they have this big banquet with Xerxes and Haman. And Haman, just the day before, is planning to kill Mordecai with a giant 75-foot post in his front yard. And Xerxes says, hey, Esther, I'm at the party now. Haman's at the party. What is it that you want? I'm curious to know what's been on your mind. You can have up to half the kingdom. That's how willing Xerxes is to entertain Esther's requests. And Esther, uniquely, you'd think, boom, now's the time to like set the trap and like call this dude out and like make all things right. But she, in her own wisdom, is going to delay. She's going to ask for another banquet on the second night. And then she asks for yet another time together for a third, like a trio. She's going for a hat trick of like appetizers and wine. She's holding for this moment to really speak what's on her mind. And this week, we're going to be talking about this topic called divine reversals. Because in this perfect moment where Esther, in the wisdom, the guidance of God, she could have blurted everything out and just like rang the bell and called Haman out for all the things that he was doing. But she's operating, although she has the right thing to do, she's waiting for the right time to do it. And I can't express to you enough where I felt like I've been in my own world, either subjected to what's happening in my life or trying to lead my family in my own life, knowing there are things to be done, but waiting for God's timing. There are two very distinct and important things. There are the right things to do, but there's also distinctly different the right time to do those. Have you ever found yourself in a position where you did the right thing, but you did it in the very wrong time? You ever been there? Have you ever been in a position where you did the wrong thing, but you did it at the timing where it was like, I know the timing's right, but you just screwed up the thing that you needed to do? I have found, yesterday I was like preparing and I was thinking, oh man, there's all these movies that depict, we love in humanity, like the divine reversal. We love the underdog story. We love the great comeback. And I was thinking of all my favorite comeback movies, like every Rocky movie is a comeback movie, right? It's like the guy's beat to a pulp against the ropes. His face is all like, bleh. And then he's like, I got one for you, Russia, right? Like that's his right move. And he's like, I must break you. So like Rocky does it. I was thinking like of newer, all the sports movies do it, like The Blind Side with Denzel Washington. And even like if you're a kid, like The Mighty Ducks, Emilio, right? Emilio, like all of those are stories of the great divine turnaround, the comeback when nobody expects it. Boom, here is like the victory. I felt challenged by God yesterday while I was preparing for this conversation because he was like, yeah, movies tell the story, but guess what? I've actually done this in your own personal life. It took some time for me. I like had to rest my mind and slow and get a little bit of pace. And then I was like, okay, God, show me where you've made divine reversals. Like the only way that we were going to see turnaround was by your hand, but show me where you've done it in my life. All the while I was like burping lively. And I was like, oh my gosh, you, right? You, child, Lion King moment. I was like, you are a divine reversal. If you know our story, like we struggled with infertility for years before we had Bravery, our oldest. 10 years of trying to have another child. It was like our story was written by doctors. This is unknown infertility. I'm sorry, no more kids. That's how the Lord allowed us to adopt Nico halfway through this infertility journey. But then 5 years in God's timing, the right time, the right thing, boom, we have Lively, and it just changes our world. Divine reversal. That is like the one that I was like spitting up on my shoulder right there for me to see and to have and to know. But then I was like, okay, Lord, show me the other ones. Like, where else have you been in my life? Divinely, by your timing and your motion, changed the course and the trajectory of my life. And we had talked a couple weeks ago about the origin story of my family. You guys all know, if you've been with us for a season or two, like my family has the ongoing, reoccurring blessing of mental instability in our family, right? We wrestle with mental health and mental illness, and it stems not just from my mom and my parents, but it's generations. I mean, you go back in the line, you start looking at it and you go like, wow, this has been something that we've had to steward and we've had to manage well for many generations. And there is a divine reversal in my family. I remember from my childhood when my parents were at a friction point because of the instability that I knew my parents were going to separate. I knew it was going to be like, it was the big one. And I have a very distinct memory, strangely, that I don't think of often because it's so traumatic, but there was like the day that my dad had all of his bags packed, and it wasn't like a front. It wasn't like the bags were by the front door. The bags were in the car. And I remember we lived in Rancho San Diego at the time, and I remember my dad getting into the car. My parents were like blowing up at each other, and it wasn't for my mom's fault because it's not something that she just drafted into her life, this like wrestling match with bipolar, but it was uncontained in this moment. And my dad like throwing in the towel. I remember him saying, I'm just going to go back to Mexico. He was going back to where stability was for him. And I remember this moment so clearly of just running out as my dad was driving away and I was just bawling in the middle of the street. And I was like praying to God that my dad would see me in the rearview mirror. And he just barely turned on the street and then he stopped. And I remember him just stopping the car and walking back and scooping me up. And I was like 11 years old or 12 years old and started that reconciliation process with my family. And I'm sorry, like 9 o'clock, you're just like, blah. But like, that was a divine reversal. Like there was no way scrawny pencil neck me in the middle of the road was going to, I'm not that way anymore, but like that I was going to be the catalyst for that. That was only between God and my dad and my mom and God's plan for our family. And if you know my parents now, like they're here. My mom and my dad are here this weekend and they're here oftentimes, but that is a divine reversal. And here's what I would challenge you as we get into the rest of this story. Like it's easy to go to like your favorite movies, but those are such shallow examples of how God in his infinite display of wisdom and care and love and joy for you and your family, he has done divine reversals in your life. I'm certain of it. Maybe though you've not recognized it for his hand in his timing and him being the source of that divine reversal. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you chapter 8, and I want to show you how God prepares a divine reversal, because where we left off last week, Esther blows the top off of the story. She calls out Haman for who he is, and she says, this is the guy who's been plotting against all the Jews, and Xerxes is like, his mind is blown, so he goes out to the gardens to kind of get himself together to figure out what to do next, and Haman is freaked to the max. He doesn't know what to do, so he throws himself kind of on Esther to try to beg for forgiveness. Right as Xerxes comes back in, he's like, not on my queen, in my house. So then instantly he calls for the guards to kill Haman, and the guards that have Haman in hand are like, what do you want us to do with him? And then one of the guards is like, hey, he's got the 75-foot post in his front yard for Mordecai, and they're like, put him on it. And so Haman dies that day. Huge reversal. Like what the hours beforehand, Haman is thinking that I'm going to get to kill Mordecai. The death of the Jews is certain. And then in this moment, divine flip of the story, God intervenes, and the greatest enemy of the Jews, Haman, is now no longer. And we pick up this story in this crazy divine reversal. It says, Esther chapter 8, verse 1 and 2, it says this, on the same day that Haman lost his corrupt battle, on the same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Super reversal. And Esther appointed who? Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. That is a divine reversal. There is nothing that Haman could have done. There is nothing that Mordecai could have done. There is nothing that Esther could have done to make that big of a story shift in their own power. And yet God is the one that does it. So here's what I want to at least, a power reversal, yes, but here's the first one. There's a monster economic reversal that happens in the lives of those who are involved in this story. A huge economic reversal. Mordecai is a peasant at best. He is not a man of great stature. He's only really known well because the story gives us his perspective. But Mordecai is just like everybody else. He's like, if you were walking in and out of Whole Foods down in La Jolla Square, you wouldn't know Mordecai outside of Mordecai being Mordecai unless you knew Mordecai. He's just an average Joe. And so the fact that Haman, who is number 2 in the kingdom, you would know that person. That would be somebody who everybody knew. You watched out for. You'd have to bow if this dude walked by you. This huge economic reversal happens for the life and the entirety of Mordecai. He gets brought from obscurity. Nobody knows what he's able to do and what he's done, and he gets drafted deeply into the king's courts. He's given Haman's home. Esther is responsible for appointing Mordecai that property now, coming, like the recipient of that kind of property would have elevated him in society in a major way. I mean, they would have been like the house at La Jolla Farms that everybody knows, the biggest house being like bankrupted and then somebody winning it in a lottery. That would have been the craziness by which Mordecai would have been on the receiving end of this massive estate. And I want to speak specifically to this economic reversal because sometimes in church, we veer away from like these big God ability stories. I'm a conservative theologian at best. If you want to know my personality, I went to a very like conservative Bible college. They're like, well, we don't know if God's still doing miracles these days. I'm not sure about that. Maybe some great displays of God's hand. I would say I've lived enough life that God has done some very distinct miracles in my life. Like my mom being alive is a miracle in our world. Our daughter being alive is a miracle in our world. Sometimes it gets touchy when we talk about God's ability to intervene in your economic situation because we're like, oh, does that mean you're going to get rich? Maybe not. But here's what it does mean. It means that God is not outside of your economic issues. God is not removed from those things. For Mordecai, it was an absolute material blessing. There's no way of getting around it. So here's what I ask you is, have you found yourself in a position where you need a massive divine turnaround when it comes to the economics in your life or the possession in your life? Do you need a car? Do you need a better place to live? Do you need some things to show up in your world where only God is going to be able to do that? I'm telling you today that per Esther in the story, that God is able to give you a divine turnaround when it comes to your economics in life. I wrote in my own notes, in one moment you don't have, and by God's hand, in the next moment you can have. In one moment you don't have, and in God's economy, by God's hand, in the next moment you can have. This is maybe something that you can't fight or break through in your own mind, but I'm telling you, by God's divine reversal, it happens in the story of Esther. I'll give you a personal example that I know. I'm just going to call him out because he's not necessarily in the room, but we all know that we're good friends. So John and I have been, Pastor John, like the master of all the things that we experience on the patio. You all know him. Vitz, husband, mullet, gorgeous mullet. John and I were in Colorado a few months back together. We got to go to like this pastor's retreat. And I never want to do those things alone because I don't want to go experience some massive breakthrough and then just be like, oh my gosh, you should have been there. I want to have somebody with me to be like, when it gets hard, when I'm back, I can be like, do you remember we remember we were praying? Yeah, we were hugging. It was awesome. John was praying and he's been praying. He's been so diligent for my entire time of knowing John about being true to God's gift in his life, which is like the ability to make and create spaces. But it's always been such a struggle for John because he's always just wanted to go chase and make lots of money. And he probably can if he got stuck in the right circles. But he's been so diligent about using the gifts that God has given him for the sake of the church. And I've just been so thankful because we've ridden that blessing for many years, over a decade together, John and I. And we were in Colorado together, and one of these pastors prays for John in like this prophetic way, says, hey, John, I just want you to know that God is going to start pouring abundance out on you in your life. And I was like listening to this, and I'm like, watch it, John, that's a big thing, dude. That guy's saying, you're going to get rich. And John and I are mature enough to know that that's not like that's over exaggerating, but the fact that somebody said it, and that's been something that John has been praying for. Lord, would you just give us a little bit more margin so my family doesn't have to stress out that much? We came back from that trip, and I'm like, what do you think that means? What do you think that means? And he's like, I just have no idea. And literally that week, Victoria got a call, his wife got a call for a job that is like a monster opportunity, and she says yes, and they pursue her, and she doesn't even have to apply. They want her, and they instantly like double their margin, not by them chasing and trying and posting and blah blah blah, by God's divine reversal. It gets even better. They're living now in the wake of that, and they're less stressed, and they're just like, wow, I can't believe how good God is. And then John was in the Marines for like a whole like tour and a half, and then he gets a call from the VA, and they're like, guess what? We're going to recognize some of the trauma that you've been through, and we're going to start like giving you back pay for some of the things that you did. I was on the phone. I was in the same office with John. He was on the phone with the VA, and John's like one tearing coming out of his, and he's like, dude, this prayer is coming to life, and I'm not doing anything about it. I'm overwhelmed at how good God is. You know John. He's a schmuck. He's right outside, right? Like, he can't do it. John, you're right there. Yes, dude, you're hiding. That is God's goodness. That is a divine reversal in your life. And sometimes we just take ourselves out of it. It's like, oh, that happens to them. That's a thing over there. I'm not in that crazy of a church. That kind of stuff happens. I'm telling you, God does what God does in God's time. Question is, are you there? Can you see it? Can you anticipate it? Do you believe that he's big enough to be able to do it? That's the question. The book of Esther, we go through it so that you would know that it's possible. That's the first, economic reversal. The second one, a power reversal. Listen to what it says. It says, then Mordecai was brought before the king. Let's just stop there. Super big observation in this one, right? Then Mordecai was brought before the king. You know what Mordecai did not do? Mordecai did not fight for a position with the king. It says that Mordecai was brought to the king. And this might be where you need to rethink the way that you're living your life, because you might be power struggling for the next thing. And Mordecai is this great example that God ushered him in without a fight. Mordecai was brought before the king. He did not pull any levers. He didn't make any quiet deals in the shadows. He was just uniquely him, faithfully him, trying to be in alignment with God. And the Bible says that Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related, Esther and Mordecai, and the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman right before he got barbecued on that skewer, and gave it to Mordecai. A signet ring is essentially like the credit card for the king and all his abilities. I wore a version of a signet ring. I put it on this morning. It was a ring that my dad gave me like just maybe a year and a half ago. And it was the ring I always saw my dad put on when they would go out on dates, my mom and my dad. And it's like my dad designed it. It's nothing like wildly valuable. If you look at it, you're like, it's a little ghetto, but I'm like, it's cool. But it reminds me of something. It reminds me that there was a blessing between my dad and I, that my dad saw me favorably. And he said, you know what, Mijo, this has been something that I've been proud to yield and hold and wield. I've worn this on great occasions, and I want you now I want this to be yours. I want you to be bestowed this thing. It's meant much to me, and now I'm giving it to you. Mordecai's on the receiving end of essentially a version, almost like sonship to the king. Now, Xerxes isn't necessarily the guy you want to call your dad. You're like, Xerxes, my dad? No, you don't want that, because Xerxes is a huge fumbling mess of a king. But the fact is that God is providing for Mordecai power and ultimately influence that Mordecai could have never bought, earned, or been born into. He gets a display of power reversal that only God could do. And here's how I'm going to apply it in our world, you and me. You may be in a work scenario where you have felt very overlooked. You may have felt very underappreciated. You might be in a relationship where you feel very underappreciated, very overlooked. You might have felt like you have been on the margins of obscurity. And per this display, I wrote in my own notes, God can take you from the margins to manager. He can take you from obscure to owner, and he can take you from being overlooked to being an overseer in his time. So you might be struggling and digging and going. I know that there are business owners amongst our community who are on the brink of bankruptcy, praying, fasting, doing anything they could for God to keep their business alive. And where and how did the turnaround happen? It happens in God's perfect timing. If you would have been on the receiving end of the blessing that you had been afforded, if you've been on that tipping side of a blessing, if he would have given it to you 9, 10, 12 months ago, you wouldn't have been ready for it. but in his time. And then here's the deal. If you're waiting for that blessing, if you're waiting for that power shift, if you're waiting for that opportunity, for that recognition, it may be that you are ready, but God's timing is not in alignment yet. I know it's hard. But I'd rather be in God's time with God's blessing than with God's blessing not in God's time. And for Mordecai, man, he nails it. He waits patiently. He does what he is able to do with what resources he has. He's meeting with Esther on the outskirts of the gates. When he gets truth, he delivers truth. He doesn't hold back truth. And then all of a sudden, boom, he gets the signet ring of the king. And now there is some power that is put into his playability. There's a power reversal. The next one, because of the storyline, Mordecai gets power, and so Mordecai now and Esther, with all the influence that they have as queen and now first advisor, they create a legal reversal for the entire kingdom. That's the next one, a legal reversal. And this one seems like, oh, well, bingo, legal things. Let me read what happens, and I'll tell you what it means for the Jews. It comes out of verse 9 and 10. It says this. It says, the king's secretaries were summoned and a decree was written exactly as Mordecai dictated. This is what happens is, I told you last week that once Haman had written into law the decree that the Jews could be wiped out in 11 months, not even the king could reverse the decree. You remember that from last week? The king doesn't have the ability to reverse what was written. And so Esther, now open about her nationality, being a Jew, and Mordecai being a Jew, they come and they petition the king. Can we write something that can cushion this tragedy that's about to happen? Can we get ahead of it with a law? And I love what King Xerxes, I didn't put it in the notes, but King Xerxes says at the beginning of this chapter, you write to the Jews as you see fit. Could you imagine having all the power of lawmaking in your hands? And the king says, you know what, instead of relying on me to figure it out and think through what the right thing is, I'm just going to put the power of the letter of the law in your hands. Why don't you write what needs to happen for your people? Could you imagine? So Mordecai and Esther start to write, and they write to the governors and the nobles of all 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. The decree was written in the scripts and languages of all the people of the entire empire, including that of the Jews. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. And Mordecai sent the dispatches by swift messengers. There's a legal reversal, and the legal reversal says this. It's the new law in front of the existing law is that now Jews are able to amass any sort of defensible weapons they can in the pursuit of this date that's going to give people the freedom to come and try to pillage against the Jews. Mordecai and Esther write, there's a new Jewish Second Amendment, and you can go load up on ammo, and you can get all the things you want. And so the Jews stack up on spears and bows and armor, and they've got like everything they can ready to defend themselves. And they go an extra step, and Mordecai and Esther write, you can defend your home and your family to the point of taking the life of anybody who attacks you, and you will not be held accountable for it. And if you see so fit, you can identify your attacker and then go kill their family and take their possessions. So it's a balancing act against the original law. And you go like, wow, that's pretty ruthless. But it's balancing the books is what they're doing. They're saying it was written that there was no defense and now you can have defense. And so the day comes and everyone's like, you know, hey, we had planned on going and like looting all of them, but I think I'm just going to stay home and like, I don't know, watch the game. Like you? Yeah, I was like ready to go and like get their like car and like that sweet house they had, but I don't know, like dying today doesn't sound good to me. And so they write a whole law that protects the Jewish people where there was no protection before it. And here's what it does is it creates this massive emotional reversal. For the Jews, they were at the bottom. There was no hope under Haman's law. None whatsoever. They were thinking, how are they going to flee? How are they going to hide? How are they going to talk to their kids about the fact that they are going to be persecuted from this day all the way up until the day of their demise? If you ever been bullied or you ever seen your kids bullied in any way, shape, or form, this would have been infinitely worse. You'd have been identified as the lowest common denominator amongst a society. And in this moment, the law changes in their favor, and there is a protection that goes out by way of messengers to all 127 provinces. And this is what Esther 8:15-17 says. It says, Mordecai went out from the king's presence, donning blue and white royal robes, a large gold crown, and fine linen and purple cape. When the people of the city of Susa, that's the capital, saw this, they exploded into joy. For the Jews, it was a time of celebration. Darkness had turned to light, sadness to joy, shame to honor. In every city and province where the king's law and orders were received, there was happiness and joy among the Jews. It says they feasted, they danced, and they celebrated. It was 100 years of straight purgatory for the Jews. It was 100 years of being marginalized, 100 years of being seen as less than, and in this one divine reversal, there is this emotive explosion amongst God's people. Here's my question for you. How long has it been since you felt that kind of true reverse in joy? I know so many of us has sat heavy-hearted because of the tension in our relationships, the tension in our workplaces, the tension with our children or our family members. God is in the business of divine reversals. He can replace, it says it in Scripture, sadness to joy, darkness to light. The night only lasts so long. Like the Lord's goodness brings the sun. So here's my question to you is there an emotional reversal that you've been praying for, that God would bring joy back to your heart, that he'd bring wholeness, shalom is that word, that wholeness back to your relationship through him with others? God is able to do that. You might be prayerfully consistent over your children and you just feel like there's no hope there, and I'm telling you, God is in the business of divine reversals. I was talking to Robert Cortez at the men's event this last week. I went to the men's night. It was so good for me. Go to the midweek men's and women's things. I went just needing to be a dude, being a dude, and just like, hug me, I'm tired, I have a newborn. And then I just was like, bleh. It was awesome. That's my spiritual fullness. The description of my spiritual fullness is just like, bleh. And my friend Robert was saying, hey, Minga, you know what's so crazy? I've been praying for my brother to know the Lord for years. And this week he told me that he went to church on his own. Divine reversal. I said, you know what's so interesting? That reminds me of John's brother, because John has been praying for his brother for years to come and know the Lord. And he's been slowly coming over to the house to ask questions and have dinner and be investigative about spirituality. Robert, just full of life, is like, man, I would have never imagined the day. And I said, you know what's so sad is that that's the position we're in, that we don't imagine that God is able to do those things. And I know what it feels like to be broken down and tired and exhausted from wanting to lob up these prayers, wondering where God is. But I'm telling you, God, give me the patience to be waiting fully for your timing and your blessings so they'd be in alignment, so it wouldn't come early, but it would come right when you need it to happen. I told Robert, maybe your brother knowing the Lord in this season is going to do something for you and your family, because his faith is going to be rich and full when it finally comes to term. And maybe that's going to be exactly what you and your family need. So here's what I'm getting to. All of these reversals, it leads ultimately to this massive spiritual reversal in the land. Huge spiritual reversal. It says this, it's one line, and I'm going to read it for you, and then I'm going to unpack it for you. It says, Esther 8:17, and many people of other nationalities became Jews. Yeah, that's awesome, but it says because fear of the Jews had seized them. It's like, whoa, you guys are way crazier. When I read that, I was like, I'm probably not into this turn or burn faith mentality. You're going to hell, get on the boat. I'm not that way. I dug into this idea of fear of the Jews, fear of the Jews. What did that mean? It wasn't it was intimidation. It wasn't that. The way that it's broken down in the Hebrew, because this is written in the Old Testament, Hebrew language, it's Two definitions: to be in awe of or to be in dire dread of. And this is the only way I could unpack it, is that if you have God with you in your story, in your soul, that there is a fear that is awe-based. You go, I could not imagine. I'm blown away. It's with God that you are in awe, but without God, you're only ever going to be stuck in fear. You're only going to be ever stuck in dread. You're going to be stuck not knowing that there is a good God who is in the business of divine reversals. My gut says that you're here because you are searching out, or you at least believe that there could be a good God. Most of us have this rich history of being with God, not perfect, but seeing his perfection on display in our imperfect lives. Here's what I'm telling you. You probably are in the life by proximity to somebody who needs to know that God can do divine reversals. You're here because of that. You're here because there is a spiritual reversal that's about to take place in somebody else's life, and you're the testimony of that. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to bring the band up on this. Don't hide your brokenness. It's easy to do. Don't hide the shortcomings that you're experiencing in this season. Don't hide the fact that you're praying for your wayward children. Don't hide the fact that there's tension in your relationships. Because when we hide those things, we actually don't give the full credit or the full story. When God remedies those things, it's like we only get half the story. People don't know the depth of God's redemption because we're too prideful to show what kind of chaos we're in this season. There's something extremely freeing about standing up here and telling you, yeah, my family's gone through a lot. We have gone through a lot. And it takes a little bit of gall to say, yeah, we don't have it together. But man, every time God shows himself good on our display, it just shows how good and how full he really is. So here's my challenge to you. Pen your prayers. Write your wants. Put a ledger down of the things that you're hoping that God would do that are divine reversals. So that when he does show up, so that when he does display himself in his fullness, you can point back to that. You can be reminded of it in your own life. But more importantly, you can tell other people who are wondering if God is for them that he's still doing incredible miracles today. We're going to close in a song that's going to blow your face off. No pressure. But I love the words of this song, and here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to end it with this way. Make this song a prayer. Pray this song before you just stand up and sing this song. But don't finish the song before you're singing the truth that is encompassed in this song. And then here's what I'd love to do. We have a prayer team at our church. And would you guys make space here afterwards? Because I know that some of you experience your breakthrough through prayer. And I would love to pray for you after service. There is a divine breakthrough that you know is on the horizon, but you're getting tired of waiting. In your humanity, I'm telling you this, prayer gives you what you need to get there. So Zane, would you help us by praying afterwards? And Mindy, would you guys join us down here just as support afterwards? Nick and Stevie, will you do the same? Awesome. Let's sing together.